Welcome to Handling Hot Moments in the Classroom. According to Lee Warren, the Harvard Teaching Center director who coined the term, a hot moment is a moment in the classroom when the emotions of students and/or faculty escalate to a level that threatens teaching and learning. Hot moments can be expected when dealing with sensitive issues, but they can come up unexpectedly too, in situations where you aren't necessarily anticipating a disruption or escalation. They can happen in all sorts of classes and disciplines, even in ones that seemingly do not directly touch on sensitive or difficult topics. For example, they may arise as students navigate group projects or differing approaches to engagement and participation. So, how do we respond? The most significant action you can take in response to a hot moment is to acknowledge it. Over and over, students tell us that they just want someone to recognize and acknowledge that something happened, that not responding does far more damage to them than responding imperfectly. You do not need to wait for an explosion to address an issue. Be mindful of small, awkward moments because they can be patterns that lead up to an explosion and because they can be damaging to students even if the whole class isn't aware of or affected by what happened. In the next few minutes, I will share strategies for how to respond when a hot moment arises, including showing care, using questions or phrases to shift the conversation, giving students ways to address these issues with each other, and appropriately apologizing and moving on when necessary. Dealing with hot moments. Pause and take time. Acknowledging that a hot moment happened doesn't mean that you have to know exactly what to do immediately. In fact, it can be better to take some time to reflect on how you will approach the situation. It is perfectly okay to say, "This is a complicated and sensitive conversation, and I want to take some time to compose my thoughts and think about how to address it." Then step back, think about a response, and address the issue later via an email or at the beginning of the next session. You can also shift the mode your students are using to interact. For example, if you are having a full class discussion, you can instead ask students to write down some thoughts privately for a couple of minutes to synthesize their perceptions. This can give you some time and de-escalate. A good prompt could be something like, "This is what just happened. Can we all take a moment to reflect? Try putting in writing the impact this could have on a student." You could also pause the conversation entirely, acknowledge that it is getting off track or that all sides are no longer being heard, and pledge to revisit it at a later point in a different way. Even if you need more time to think about how exactly you will respond to the content, you can still show care in the moment. You can attempt to demonstrate a very calm and grounding presence. You can ask students how they take care of themselves when they feel frustrated or upset and invite them to implement those strategies. You can also use your facilitation skills to model productive approaches. For example, the notion in educational environments of going hard on the idea but soft on the person. You can immediately depersonalize by referring to the idea as opposed to so-and-so's comment. But do keep in mind that part of being inclusive is recognizing that the impact of a statement may be different than its intent. Students might not always realize they're doing harm, and their good intent doesn't always help diffuse the harm. Ultimately, the harm is what you need to address. Responding to hot moments is something you can practice, and it's helpful to practice it in lower stakes moments so you can be prepared. Depending on your teaching persona, some responses will feel more comfortable and easier to implement than others. Knowing those in advance can help you feel more confident in the moment. Prepare language to help. When responding in the moment, interrupter phrases can shift the conversation. One way to think about this is through the language of calling out and calling in. Calling out refers to the difficult process of letting someone know that their words or actions won't be tolerated in a space. It's an opportunity to press the pause button as a group. But the act of calling out, while sometimes necessary, can place the focus too strongly on an individual or shift focus away from the words or behavior you want to call out and to the virtue or superiority of the people doing the calling out. Calling in is a variation on this. When you call someone in, you're inviting them into the conversation as a way to explore something more deeply and try to achieve mutual understanding. It's more about reflection than about the initial reaction. Each of these techniques, when done thoughtfully, can be effective in the classroom. Sometimes the most effective approach is to shut something down and move on. Sometimes you might want to shift the conversation into a deeper interrogation. The bigger picture point here is to think about the process of the conversation, which may be easier to exert leverage over than the content. In addition to exploring individual perspectives, you can explore the very nature of discussing difficult topics, or interrogate the approaches and assumptions used in your field. Here are a couple more concrete examples of questions that can help you zoom out to a higher level of discussion. These process questions can be really helpful for thinking about why these conversations can be so fraught and emotional. So far, we have discussed strategies for responding to hot moments as an instructor. It's important to make clear that the burden for addressing a traumatic reaction in the classroom is something that you will take on, that it doesn't need to fall on the students experiencing the reaction. However, you can work with your students to develop strategies that they can use if they feel comfortable doing so. For example, at the beginning of the semester or before a time when you think a hot moment might emerge, you can set some collective agreements for what a respectful, productive discussion looks like. These are often called community norms, discussion guidelines, or online netiquette. Another phrase that's helpful in thinking about this is invitations for engagement. An invitation is something you need to accept, so you're asking students to consciously assent to a set of practices, which reinforces both their agency and their accountability. You can invite students to brainstorm these from scratch, or you can start with a set of premises and ask them whether there's anything they want to add or subtract. Then ask them to sign off on these principles and post them in a public place, like Blackboard. Once in a while, you can revisit these principles with students and see if they have been effective or if they need revision. You might consider tenets like step in by participating in a discussion, raising your hand, or using the chat. If you are typically someone who brings forth ideas and questions, take a step back and create space for others who don't typically come forth first. Approach others with curiosity rather than judgment. If something doesn't sit right with you, ask a question. Try not to generalize. Voice from yourself first rather than assuming that you know what someone else is going through, even if you have a shared identity. Focus your sharing out beyond the class on strategies and resources rather than the anecdotes that people have shared in confidence. When introducing invitations to engagement is best done at the beginning of the semester, and therefore may be an approach you save for a future teaching situation, you can check in with students about your classroom community at any point in the term, using principles like these to inform the conversation. Keep in mind, though, that trained academics are often taught to apply a distancing, evidentiary lens, but experiences like racism, sexism, and discrimination may be a hot topic to some, but are just life for others. Not everyone has the ability to distance. Some of the common guidelines we use can play out in problematic ways if marginalized and minoritized folks are asked to do the additional labor of holding space for people who say or do things that may actually be harmful, no matter their intent. This is why addressing the impact of a statement, regardless of its intention, can make the classroom more welcoming to everyone. In addition to settling invitations for engagement, you can put systems in place for students to notify you of issues as they arise. Creating ways for students to say, "This hurt me," or "I made a mistake," can normalize the process of discussing challenging topics and learning from those conversations. Whether on your own or with students, consider in what ways students can flag a stereotypical, biased, or otherwise hurtful utterance. This can take many forms. Some students might be comfortable saying that their peers said something offensive and calling them out directly, but some may not. You can create other means for them to let you know that an incident occurred. For example, a Google form asking them to evaluate the session more generally, but with an open-ended space for any sort of feedback. Because the burden of flagging a harmful utterance can often fall on people who are already most likely to be harmed by it, create ways for students to do what they need to do to take care of themselves. This could mean stepping away without penalty or following up with you individually if they have questions. Be aware, too, that not every moment is as clear-cut as someone noticing or flagging an issue. If something feels off, you can comment on that too. For example, if you're looking at students' faces and see a few of them wince, you can say something like, "It seems like I said something unacceptable. Can we talk about that?" And think about creating spaces for sincere apology. You can model this for students by thanking them for raising issues and suggesting how you'll change your approach. In closing, as you respond to hot moments, keep in mind that things will happen in the classroom, especially if you are talking about important but difficult issues. The goal isn't necessarily to avoid these moments, but to respond productively when they arise. Communication recovery is a way to do this. If a moment arises where a student or you makes a harmful, biased, or damaging utterance, you can recognize that the offense took place and take ownership of it. Apologize, make clear how you will adjust your behavior in response, and move forward. With this process, you can feel more confident and equipped to face the situations that arise in your classes.